Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I am Nicole Golden. I'm non-resident senior fellow in the Geoeconomic Center at Atlantic Council. And I'm live here at our studio, broadcast studio at the IMF in Spring Meetings Week. And I'm delighted today, right now, to be joined by UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development, Navid Hanif. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
have you here. We're more than halfway to the SDGs 2030 deadline, and unfortunately we are well off track in many places in many countries to achieve those goals. Progress in more than 50% of the targets is weak, insufficient, and 30% have installed a reverse per some of the UN reports. Earlier this week, the bank released its Great Reversal report, which illuminated how the extent to which development gains that we've had have been lost since the pandemic, and in particular, how lower income countries are in particular facing challenges. If current trends continue, the UN estimates that 600 million people will still be living in extreme poverty come 2030 and the end of the goals. Last week, your office released its annual report on the state of financing for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and said bold action is needed. All right. So beyond the headline, which is that more than $4 trillion is needed to finance the SDGs, what do we need to understand about the financing situation beyond that kind of big headline?
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
The numbers you have captured just now kept convey part of the reality. The reality, just let me mention, it's yes, poverty did go up after the pandemic. It's now trend is not that high, but yes, 600 million people will still be living in poverty by 2030 if we do not take action now. Significant number of countries, 25 or more, are spending 20% of their budget on debt servicing.
Wow.
So more on what they are spending on hospitals and schools. So that is future generation. If you don't invest today, the young people you will get in the job market won't be well trained, won't be healthy, won't be well fed. So these are the kind of challenges we are facing for society. So the 2030 agenda, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, clearly captured the needs, the inputs that are required. So the gap has grown from 2.5 trillion to $4 trillion since the pandemic, and unfortunately it's growing. We need immediate actions, and the Financing for Sustainable Development report outlines those actions very clearly. First and foremost is quick, fast action in giving most of these countries, middle income, low income countries, access to affordable long term finance. And that is, and I would emphasize concessional finance.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not talking about charity or money which is simply aid money. It's money that has clearly objectives that they need to achieve on investing in the sustainable development goals and climate action. UN has made a proposal which has been presented by the Secretary General. One possibility is to deploy special drawing rights
Okay.
to give countries and the multilateral development banks space to create liquidity that they can lend to these countries, which is a very practical measure in providing access to finance to these countries. Let me also emphasize that the public finance is also required to mobilize private investment. You have to reduce the cost of capital for these countries to access. As of now, we call it technical terms blended finance. Mostly middle income countries have benefited from it. Low income countries could not benefit because they required public money to move in to mobilize private capital that can go and invest in those countries on energy transition, in health systems, in food systems, and digitalization.
I'm glad you brought up the private capital mobilization because that is something that has been a big topic of conversation. And in particular on the climate finance side, I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about that because we know that, whether it's as a result, again, of the debt service and the inability to divert those resources for climate adaptation and mitigation, that the climate finance aspect of the sort of SCG financing challenge at large um, is is robust, and in particular, those a lot of the lower income countries are also the most climate vulnerable, small islands and developing states. So, how do you think about in this kind of broader financing for development challenge, and in the report? How do you think in particular about, and what are some of those other specific solutions on, de-risking finance for climate interventions in particular?
Climate action cannot be postponed. It's happening now, and we need to deal with it, both with reducing emissions, which is we call mitigation,
Yep.
and adaptation, which is a development challenge also. It's lives and livelihoods of people. When they lose through natural disasters, the impacts, you need to give them immediate resources to rebound. So that's the emphasis we have repeatedly conveyed. But the FSDR also makes a case. You can't separate climate from the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also one of the SDGs, SDG 13.
Great.
So actions on Sustainable Development Goals also help countries to deal with climate consequences of climate change and better prepare, better adapt. We have seen that societies who get investment in infrastructure, they are better prepared for climate catastrophes and disasters. So I won't separate climate finance from SDG finance. At the same time, I also want to emphasize the scale for climate finance is again higher, and that needs to be met through both concessional finance, market mobilization, which means private sector mobilization, and also blending. But the challenge we are facing on climate finance is it's mostly going into mitigation,
Right.
energy transition, which is very attractive to private investors.
Sure.
But I must commend the multilateral development banks now are moving towards allocating money to adaptation also.
Yeah.
And climate change should also be a factor in macroeconomic criticality.
Yes.
It's not just a non-economic issue. Climate change has serious consequences for our macroeconomic stability. So the report also makes a case. On the debt side, report is presenting debt swaps.
Right.
And let me clearly convey that means if a country is willing to spend in adaptation, the debt could be swapped for countries' investment in adapting to climate change. Countries willing to invest in energy transition, debt could be swapped for investing in energy transition. So there are a number of proposals on debt swaps to address, and also when you are lending, there should be clauses in the contracts which we call them when you're hit with a climate disaster, you can immediately get relief on your
Right.
debt. So this is also a proposal in the report to address the issues of debt challenges in climate financing by making sure countries can deal with the urgent problems that come their way because of climate
The
change.
urgency could not be more palpable, I think, this week. You've been here all week. I'm sure you've heard it. And it's really interesting and I think useful to hear you talk about how they really is one agenda. I think for a while now, as the climate agenda has come more into urgency, into the fore of the development dialogue, there have been questions whether it's at the IMF and to some extent at the World Bank as well as two agendas. Should we be doing climate or should we be doing development? Should we be doing climate if I'm at the IMF and I'm worried about macro stability? And to your point, there's this realization, and you articulate it so clearly, that it's not two separate agendas, that it really is, you can't do one without the other. And, ahead of next week's Financing for Development Forum, and the associated investment fair, what messages since you've been here all week, having these conversations, are you, bringing from this week, and what are you sort of sharing into to next week? And what do you see as the role of the Bretton Woods institutions coming up on 80 years old this summer in financing and achieving the SDGs? And how are you sort of bringing that into the conversations going forward?
First, it's a wrong question to ask climate change and development can be separated.
Yeah.
We are facing it on a daily basis. In climate finance, investment in the SDGs are part of the same equation, and we should treat them that well.
Agreed.
Let me also convey the messages from the Financing for Sustainable Development report. 4 clear messages. Close the investment gap, the financing gap, which may become the financing development divide,
Yeah.
because we are in a sustainable development crisis. The report conveys it unambiguously. It's a sustainable development crisis. Low growth prospects and the lack of investment is a recipe for disaster. So first and foremost, close the investment gap. Second, close the gaps in the financial architecture, be it multilateral development banks, capital increases, their operational improvements, be it taxation. So those architectural gaps should be closed. Third, close the credibility gap and trust. That is unfortunately getting a big hit, and we need to rebuild that. Fourth, let's develop development pathways and policy frameworks which are geared towards sustainable development goals and making sure that we are not unprepared, ill-prepared for climate action, climate consequences that are coming our way. 4 messages from the report. Financing for Development Forum. It is a big gathering that will happen in New York, and executive directors, senior officials from the IMF and the World Bank will travel to New York also. What do we expect? First of all, let me acknowledge and appreciate what they are doing for improving the operations of the multilateral development banks.
Yep.
Commendable effort.
Absolutely.
I want to commend President Banga and his team and all the MDBs who are working collectively to increase delivery, to increase resources by optimizing the balance sheets. But that will not be sufficient. When I look at the
Necessary
scale,
but insufficient.
yeah. And when I look at the scale, we all promised in 2014 billions to trillions. We are nowhere near that. And that should also be acknowledged. At some stage, we have to think about capital increases. I know it's political, it will take time, but we should start thinking. It is needed, it will have to be done. So that's from the MDBs we expect. We also expect country level impact. Focus on countries' development needs, poverty eradication, hunger. So they need to also pay attention while they are investing in climate change. Both are important. We need to improve the life of every citizen
Yes.
on this planet, on a secure planet. That's what they need to focus on. From the IMF, our message clearly is great job by creating the Resilience and Sustainability Trust Fund,
Yes.
commendable, but not sufficient. They also need to find a creative way of channeling SDRs to the multilateral development banks who can leverage 5 to 7 times, which will be the badly needed liquidity and investment that developing countries need. So we are recommending this action for them to consider. So creating fiscal space for countries, which is shrinking every day. Debt servicing, social protection, investing in SDGs, how will they meet these challenges if they don't have liquidity?
And I mean, really important to hear you both commend, but say we've had some progress, we've got farther, we've got space, we've got more to do, right? That's what I'm hearing. Along with the FFD Forum is the investment fair and going the SDG investment fair and going back to the private sector. How do you see that opportunity? Are there particular areas that you're seeing the most opportunity, the most uptake, the partnerships? Had a conversation earlier today on the digital opportunities, and obviously that's a really critical piece of the financing and how some of the digital tools can also help smooth, if you will, or create efficiencies in the financing system. How are you thinking about that aspect of this going into the investment form, but also just in generally going forward?
The SDG Investment Fair has been a platform for every member of the United Nations, but mostly for countries where investors do not usually go.
Yeah.
No, it's easier for middle income and high income countries to get investments.
Yeah.
It's the low income countries who struggle. So the SDG Investment Fair, open to everyone, but we encourage those countries to engage with potential investors with projects that are attractive,
Right.
both in terms of revenues but impact. That's critical. So the area, first, what has happened, and I have witnessed this change, although some claim a lot of money is now flowing towards energy transition, towards impact investment. Figures vary, but there's a figure of $30 trillion as well if you look at the ESG. But I have to be careful. Impact measurement is a challenging field.
Yes.
So, what I have witnessed in the last couple of years, growing interest by the private sector on the infrastructure side. Many platforms have been developed. Actually, our own Global Investors for Sustainable Development Alliance members have developed sustainable infrastructure investment platform.
Okay.
So that's encouraging.
Yes.
And I have seen big asset managers are moving into this field.
Yeah.
That is one area of investment badly needed. Infrastructure investments, both for adaptation but also for development, education, health. So that's one sector where I hope and I'm confident investment will flow if we get the right projects. And that's where we are focused in the SG Investment Fair. Other areas which we call six transitions, energy transition, food system transition, digital is also one of them. Huge opportunities for societies to leapfrog, and private sector is showing interest. What do we need? De-risking, risk sharing, public sector coming in, MDBs coming in. What do we need? Project preparation. Countries don't have the capacities. And then project implementation to get the results. So all of these aspects should be addressed by the MDBs, the governments, and of course the private investors also should come in with this mindset. They are here to improve societies and not only to make profits. This mindset also needs to change. I'm not saying they should forgive their fiduciary duty.
Right.
This is someone's saving, someone's pension. But those asset owners want to make impact. So they should be given the opportunity to improve lives of people all around this planet.
It's a really important point. I was talking at this very table this morning with Jorge Moreira de Silva, Executive Director of UN Ops, and we were talking about that implementation gap and the demand side, if you will, of projects and of the financing. But to your point about the bankable projects, it's a really important one, and about bringing to light some of, like you said, the countries that don't necessarily get the visits, or that it's harder to get their projects out there, because we sometimes don't necessarily see enough from the demand side in terms of having those projects that are ready to go, that are ready to be invested in, that can absorb the money that's already there. And we were talking about this in the context of IDA resources and the replenishment, and how do you not only, again, make sure that the projects and the investments are ready to go to take the money that's already there, but also bring in the additional resources. And we're talking a little bit about the fragile and conflict affected situation, and how do you see that, the increase, if you will, that we're seeing more incidents of conflict and violence, more incidents than since World War II around the world. How are you dealing, or how are you thinking about fragility and conflict in the context of the work you're doing and financing for development? How are you seeing those settings having even further challenges? We know that obviously fragility and conflict will undermine private investment as well as public investment, and then the diversion of resources. How are you thinking about that, and what are some of the potential solutions in those contexts?
More than 1 billion people live in countries confronted with conflicts. Billion people are living in such countries. You may call them fragile, conflict affected, whatever name you give them.
Yeah.
They are dealing with these situations on a daily basis. And we understand, again, let's not forget the underlying causes of conflicts. We, not always, but in most of the cases, it's poverty, it's exclusion,
Exactly.
it's in some cases driven by very economic measures that repress some parts of the society. So these are factors which we need to address. And they also lead to disgruntled youth, disheartened young people who are looking for jobs and better future. So we are trying to address those underlying causes in our everyday work by looking at generating data for youth, working with young people. How do we create opportunities for employment for them? And they find hope in the future that will have better lives.
And there's such a connection to what you were just talking about in terms of those sectors. When you think about infrastructure, whether it's traditional infrastructure, digital infrastructure, health and education infrastructure, those are jobs. Green transition is also an opportunity. It's a challenge for some, and your point about adaptation, not necessarily seeing as much financing. The more we're creating that investment, that is also a job opportunity in a lot of these sectors. It's work that will be done by people, so we have to get the skilling right to help kind of close some of those skills mismatches and kind of connect those dots, if you will, between the opportunity and the needs. And so I see that as a circle as well. I want to switch to one of the other hats you wear, which is the UN Sous Sherpa to the G20, an area that we at the Atlantic Council have been working quite closely on different aspects of the G20, Brazil being the host this year. What are some of the UN priorities for the G20, and what does that agenda look like for you?
Brazil's presidency is commendable. The way they have brought the issues of social inclusion, social justice, advancing sustainable development, and improving the international global governance architecture. These are all aligned with the United Nations Agenda, 2030 Agenda, and the Summit of the Future Agenda
Right.
on global governance reform. So we are very closely working with the Brazilian presidency and many members of the G20 to generate momentum within G20 on the alliance they are going to launch on poverty and hunger, which is global mobilization against poverty and hunger, President Lula's personal commitment to end it. They're also launching global mobilization to fight climate change, and we are fully behind that priority. Then Brazil has also picked up the issue of strengthening international cooperation on tax. You may say, I want to exercise my right to tax. You cannot unless there is global cooperation, because wealthy people can move their wealth from one jurisdiction to another. So Brazil is committed to have global cooperation to tax the high net worth individuals. But we are also working with Brazil on a number of other aspects of G20 work, which we find are very closely aligned with the United Nations goal in the area of trade, which is also requiring collective multilateral action to improve those conditions. So G20 this time and in the previous presidency, we have been able to advance UN objectives through G20 agreements on sustainable development, on social inclusion, on climate change, on energy transition, and this time on taxation as well. And we are presenting our positions very vocally in every meeting and working with the presidency to inject this analysis from the United Nations in moving the agenda forward.
It's such important points. You mentioned the tax piece in particular, and the taxes, it's a really robust part of the fiscal space story, and it's not always as, sexy, so to speak, for people to talk about, but it's really important, both from a domestic resource mobilization story as well as a inclusion and an equity perspective across countries. You mentioned governance, and people have heard me say before, inclusive growth starts with inclusive governance. And that's at the multilateral level between countries as well as within countries. So also glad to see that is a priority for obviously both the UN and for Brazil and the G20. We are coming up on our time, but I just wanted to ask you, we've been talking about the challenges. There's a lot of them. Some of the stories not so great. The debt situation. What are you optimistic about?
Human agency. That's what gives me optimism. And let me tell you,
Please.
you might hear from, 2030 agenda is not achievable. Today, if we change our policy actions and we decide to invest in the right way, 2030 agenda remains achievable. So it's our decision, our collective action to let countries accumulate capital, invest in growth, invest in inclusion, invest in resilience, invest in the future of their young people. We will be able to achieve 2030 agenda. That's one clear message I want to convey. Second, in this house, I've been attending so many meetings. What gives me hope, they all agree on the diagnostics. For instance, there's a large measure of agreement. That's why you have the MDB evolution roadmap and reforms. All of them tend to agree the system is not working the way it is. It won't take us to billions to trillions. It won't address inequality. It won't deal with climate change with the speed and scale that are needed. So they all agree on that. That's very encouraging. We agree on the problem and we have initiated solutions also. MDB reform is a clear message. Public finance will come in to mobilize private. I also see on the private sector, the interest is growing. It's not just making profit, it's making difference. It's creating not just value, but driving value-driven development in societies. So I remain fairly optimistic and strongly confident. Human agency, when we decide to do something, we will make a difference in the lives of people all over the world. And let's not forget, we have to save the planet. And that's where collective action needs to happen much faster than where we are. And I am very optimistic. Human agency will prevail and collective action will accelerate at the scale where we need it.
Well, I appreciate that optimism. I am thrilled to hear it. We need more of it, but with a dose of realism and pragmatism that you clearly bring to this conversation. So I'm grateful for you for taking the time to join me this morning here at our week at the Atlantic Council, and I wish you good luck next week. I will be up for part of it, so I will hopefully look forward to seeing you again and maybe continuing our reflection. But I know it's a big week, so thank you. Thank you all for tuning in to us here. Continue to follow the Atlantic Council. We've got a few more events here this week at the spring meetings, and see all of our live analysis online as well at atlanticcouncil.org. Thanks for tuning in.